Maria had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because her alarm went off, but because her mind never really shut down anymore. It just kept running numbers, rehearsing worst-case scenarios and reminding her of every bill she hadn't paid yet. She had dressed quietly in the dark, careful not to wake her 2 kids, packed a single carry-on bag that had to last her 3 days, and double-checked the folder with her resume at least 5 times before stepping out into the cold El Paso morning. This trip to Chicago wasn't a vacation. It wasn't even close. It was a last real shot, a job interview she had spent 3 months scraping together money to make happen, cutting back on groceries, skipping her own lunches, and canceling the small internet plan she used to let her son do his homework online. Every sacrifice she had made for the past 90 days was riding on a single hour-long interview with a company that had emailed her back when almost no one else had. So when she finally buckled herself into the window seat of that flight, with her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, squeezed beside her and a granola bar tucked in her pocket that she planned to split for both their breakfasts, Maria didn't feel the relief of finally being on her way. She felt the full, crushing weight of everything that had led her here. The plane smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. Lily was already restless, pulling at the tray table and asking questions Maria didn't have the energy to answer fully. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, handed her a small stuffed rabbit from the bag, and leaned back just enough to breathe. That's when she opened the change purse. She didn't mean to do it somewhere people could see. It was just habit at this point, this nervous ritual of counting what she had left, as if the number might have changed since the last time she checked. It hadn't. $14.73. That was what stood between her and the next 3 days. Bus fare to the interview site, maybe one small meal, and whatever she could hold together with careful planning and a lot of hope. She counted the coins twice, stacking them quietly in her palm, her lips pressed together in that tight way people do when they're trying very hard not to feel what they're feeling. She didn't notice the man in the aisle seat watching. James Calloway was 52 years old, the kind of man who usually moved through airports in a private lane with someone else handling his bags. He had built his logistics company from a single truck and a contact list into a business that now employed over 400 people across 3 states. He was sharp, practical, and had long stopped being surprised by much of anything. But today was different. His private jet had gone in for a maintenance check, and for the first time in probably 4 years. He was sitting in a regular seat on a regular flight, sandwiched between a mother with a toddler and a college student who had already fallen asleep against the window. He had planned to use the flight to catch up on emails. Instead, without meaning to, he had glanced over at the right moment, just as Maria was quietly separating her coins into small piles on the fold-out tray, her eyes focused and calm in the way people get when they've already moved past embarrassment and into pure survival mode. He didn't stare. He looked away quickly, the way a decent person does. But something about that moment stayed with him. There was nothing dramatic about it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for help. She was just a woman on a plane, doing the quiet math of a life that didn't have much margin for error, taking care of her little girl with one hand and holding herself together with the other. James put his phone face down on his knee. The emails could wait. Outside the window, the ground was falling away below them, El Paso shrinking into a grid of tiny lights and brown rooftops. And Maria kept her eyes on it for just a moment. The city where she had struggled, where she had raised her kids mostly alone, where she had learned to make something out of almost nothing. Then she turned back, tucked the coins away, and pulled Lily close. She had no idea that the man sitting 2 feet away from her was about to change the entire direction of her life. And honestly, neither did he, not yet. It started with a juice box. Lily had been doing well for the first hour, sitting quietly, chewing on the ear of her stuffed rabbit, watching the clouds outside the window like they were the most interesting thing she had ever seen. Maria had been grateful for the calm, grateful enough that she had let herself close her eyes for just a few minutes and rest her head against the seat. But then the turbulence hit, nothing serious. Just a short, rough patch that made the plane shudder and dip, and Lily's little cup of apple juice went sideways, rolling off the tray and splashing across Maria's lap, across the armrest, and straight onto James's sleeve. Maria's eyes flew open. Lily froze. And for one horrible second, Maria felt that familiar wave of shame that single mothers know too well. The feeling of taking up too much space, being too much trouble, not having things under control the way you're supposed to. She was already apologizing before the words were even fully formed, reaching into her bag with shaking hands for the small travel pack of wipes she always carried. Her cheeks flushed and her voice tight with that specific kind of embarrassment that goes deeper than just spilled juice. But James didn't flinch. He didn't sigh or shift away or give her that look, the one that says you're an inconvenience. He just reached up calmly, pulled a handful of napkins from the seat pocket in front of him, and held them out to her without any drama at all. "It's just a sleeve," he said simply, and the way he said it made it clear he genuinely meant it. Maria took the napkins. She cleaned up Lily first, then herself, then glanced over at him once more with an apology still sitting on her lips. He had already turned back toward the window, unbothered, like the whole thing had already been forgotten. She didn't know what to make of that. Most people would have at least made a face. Lily, now calm again, looked up at the man beside her mother with the fearless curiosity that only very small children have and said, without any introduction, "That's my rabbit." She held it up for him to see. James looked at the rabbit. Then he looked at Lily, and something in his face softened in a way that didn't match the serious, pressed collar image of the man he appeared to be. "He looks like a good rabbit," he said, with complete sincerity. Lily nodded like this was the correct answer and went back to looking out the window. Maria let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A few minutes passed in silence before James asked, not intrusively, but in the easy way of someone making normal conversation on a long flight where she was headed. She told him Chicago. He nodded and asked if it was for work. She paused for just half a second, the way people do when they're deciding how honest to be with a stranger. And then she said, "Yes, a job interview," and left it there. But he asked a follow-up question, not in a pushy way, just genuinely curious. And something about the fact that he actually waited for her answer instead of just filling the silence with his own story made her say a little more than she planned to. She told him it was for an operations role at a supply chain company downtown. She told him she had been working 2 part-time jobs back home and that this felt like the first real opening she had seen in a long time. She didn't tell him about the coins. She didn't tell him about the 3 months of cutting back or the borrowed favor from her neighbor who had watched her son that morning so she could make this flight. But she didn't have to. James was the kind of man who had spent 30 years reading people, not in a manipulative way, but in the way of someone who had built a business by understanding what people actually needed versus what they were saying out loud. He could hear the weight underneath her words. He asked about her background, not like he was interviewing her, but like he was actually interested. And Maria found herself talking more easily than she expected about her experience coordinating schedules and managing small teams, about the systems she had built at her last full-time job before everything fell apart, about the way she had always been good at making order out of chaos. She laughed a little when she said that last part, a small, tired laugh, and James smiled and said that was actually a rare thing. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since she had boarded that plane, she felt like a person again, not just a problem trying to hold itself together at 30,000 feet. The pilot came over the intercom to announce they were beginning their descent into Chicago, and Maria felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. The closer they got to landing, the more real the interview became, and the more real it became. The louder that voice in the back of her head got, the one that had been whispering for weeks that she wasn't ready, that she was going to walk in there and fall apart, that the woman who had been surviving on $14 and a granola bar had no business sitting across from a hiring manager at a company like that. She had started quietly gathering Lily's things, tucking the rabbit back into the bag, folding the little blanket she had brought, doing all the small tasks of a mother preparing to land because keeping her hands busy was the only way she knew how to keep her thoughts from spiraling. That's when James glanced over at her and asked, in a completely casual tone, which company she was interviewing with. She told him the name, and something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed her, but just a slight stillness, the kind that crosses a person's face when they're deciding something. He nodded slowly and was quiet for a moment, and Maria assumed he was just being polite, just wrapping up the conversation the way strangers do when a flight is ending. But then he said, carefully and without any cruelty in it, that he knew that company well. He said he knew the hiring manager personally, had done business with them a few years back. And then he said something that made Maria go very still. He told her, plainly and honestly, that the company had a reputation for hiring people at the lowest possible starting salary and giving them very little room to grow from there. He wasn't trying to scare her. His voice was the same calm, even tone it had been the whole flight. But he looked at her directly when he said it, the way someone does when they respect you enough to tell you the truth instead of letting you walk into something blind. Maria didn't know what to say. She had spent 3 months building toward this one interview, had told herself over and over that if she could just get this job, things would start to get better. Hearing that the thing she had been holding on to might not be what she thought it was hit her somewhere deep and quiet. She looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep against her arm, completely peaceful, completely unaware, and Maria felt that specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. James watched her for a moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small notebook and a pen, the old-fashioned kind that people who still prefer writing things by hand always seem to carry. He wrote something down, tore the page out carefully, and then set it on the tray in front of her. On it was a name, a phone number, and a time, 9 o'clock the next morning. He told her that he ran a logistics company, that he had an operations coordinator position that had been open for 6 weeks, and that he had interviewed a lot of people for it. He said that in the past 2 hours, sitting next to her on this plane, he had heard her talk about her experience and the way she thought about problems, and that she had more of the right instincts for that role than most of the people who had come in specifically for the interview. Maria stared at the piece of paper. She didn't pick it up right away. Part of her was waiting for the catch, for the moment where this stopped being real and turned into something she would have to politely back away from. But James had already moved on, calling the flight attendant over and quietly settling the tab for everything Maria and Lily had ordered during the flight, before she could even process what was happening. When she tried to object, he simply shook his head and said something she would still be thinking about years later, that she had been carrying everything on her own for a long time, and that letting one person help her didn't erase any of the hard work she had done to get herself here. The wheels of the plane touched down, and the cabin filled with the usual sounds of people unbuckling and reaching for overhead bags. And Maria sat completely still in her seat with a torn piece of notebook paper in her hand and her sleeping daughter on her arm, feeling for the first time in a very long time like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The hotel room was small and smelled like carpet cleaner and old air conditioning, the kind of room that exists purely for function and nothing else. But Maria had been grateful for it anyway, because it had a lock on the door and a bed where Lily could sleep safely. And right now, that was enough. She had given Lily a bath, gotten her settled, and then sat on the edge of the mattress in the quiet dark with the piece of notebook paper in her hand, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. The name, the number, the time, 9 o'clock. The handwriting was neat and certain, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who means what they write. She had set it on the nightstand, then picked it up again, then set it down. Her mind was doing that thing it always did when something felt too good, pulling it apart, looking for the part where it stopped making sense, building the case for why she shouldn't trust it. She thought about the fact that she didn't really know this man, that she had met him on a plane 2 hours ago, that people say things in the soft, disconnected bubble of air travel that they don't necessarily mean once their feet are back on the ground. She thought about how foolish she would feel showing up at some office building downtown at 9 in the morning only to find out it had been a polite gesture that was never meant to be taken literally. She thought about all of this for a long time, sitting in the dark with Lily's small, steady breathing filling the room, until she finally reached for her phone and called her mother back in El Paso. Her mother listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was unusual for her. And when Maria finished talking, the line was quiet for just a moment before her mother said 4 words that cut straight through every single argument. Maria had been building in her head, "What do you lose?" Not even a question, really, just a plain, simple truth delivered in the unbothered voice of a woman who had survived enough hard things to know that fear dressed up as logic was still just fear. Maria stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. And by the time she said goodnight and set it down, she had already decided, even if she hadn't said it out loud yet. She barely slept. She was up before 6, got Lily fed and dressed, and dropped her at a nearby family daycare she had arranged in advance, and then stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel in the sharp Chicago morning air and looked up the address James had written on the paper. The building was 40 minutes away by bus. She checked the time, checked her bag, straightened her jacket, and went. The offices of Callaway Logistics were on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, clean and well lit, with the kind of quiet hum of a place where real work actually gets done. The woman at the front desk greeted her by name, which caught Maria off guard, and walked her to a small conference room where a woman from HR was already waiting with a notepad and a cup of coffee set out for her. James was not there. Maria scanned the room instinctively, half expecting him, half relieved he wasn't, because she wasn't sure how she would have felt sitting across from him again after everything. What she didn't know, what she would only find out much later, was that James had left specific instructions before she arrived. He had told his HR director to give her a full and real interview. No shortcuts, no special treatment, no softballs just because he had vouched for her. He wanted her to get the job because she was right for it, not because he had put his thumb on the scale. So that's exactly what happened. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. They asked her hard questions, practical questions, the kind that can't be answered with rehearsed lines, but only with real experience and honest thinking. Maria answered every one of them the way she had always solved problems, directly, practically, without pretending to know things she didn't. She talked about systems she had built at previous jobs, about how she managed competing priorities when resources were tight, about the way she communicated with people under pressure. At one point, she made the interviewer laugh, genuinely laugh, and Maria felt something loosen in her chest. She flew home the next evening, not knowing the answer yet, but feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, not just hope, but the quiet, solid kind that doesn't need to shout because it's built on something real. 3 days passed and Maria heard nothing. Then 4. She kept her phone close the way people do when they're waiting for something that matters, checking it more times than she could count, telling herself every morning that today was probably not the day, and then spending the rest of the day quietly hoping she was wrong. She had gone back to her regular routine because that was the only thing she knew how to do. Back to the early mornings, the double shifts, the packed lunches and school drop-offs, and the long drives home, where she let herself be tired in private so her kids never had to see it. She hadn't told many people about the interview, or about James, or about any of it. Partly because she didn't have the words to explain it without it sounding like something she had made up. And partly because she had learned a long time ago that hope shared too early has a way of making the disappointment heavier when things don't work out. So she kept it close, carried it quietly, and waited. On the fifth day, just after 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang with a Chicago area code, and Maria stood completely still in the middle of her kitchen with a dish towel in her hand and answered it on the second ring. It was the HR director from Callaway Logistics. She said that the team had completed their review, that Maria had been the strongest candidate they had interviewed for the position, and that they would like to offer her the role. The salary she named was nearly double what Maria had been making working her 2 part-time jobs combined. Full benefits. A start date 3 weeks out to give her time to make arrangements. Maria said thank you in a voice that was steadier than she felt. Wrote everything down on the back of an envelope that was sitting on the counter. Said thank you again, and then stood there after the call ended just breathing for her. A long moment before she slid down against the kitchen cabinet and sat on the floor and let herself cry. Not the scared kind of crying she had been doing for months in the dark after the kids were asleep, but the other kind. The kind that only comes when something you had almost stopped believing in turns out to be real. Lily wandered in from the other room, took one look at her mother sitting on the kitchen floor with wet cheeks, and sat down next to her without asking any questions, which was the most comforting thing anyone had done for Maria in a long time. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed once. A text from a number she had saved simply as James. 2 words. Told you. She laughed out loud at that, a real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and she typed back a single thank you that felt completely inadequate for what she actually meant but was the best she could do in that moment. In the weeks that followed, everything changed in the way that real change actually happens. Not all at once and not without difficulty, but steadily, one thing at a time. She relocated to Chicago with her 2 kids, found a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood with a good school nearby. And for the first time, her son had his own room and stopped doing homework on his bed. She enrolled Lily in a proper preschool with a little garden out front where the kids grew tomatoes in the spring. She bought a dining table, a real one, not a folding one, and they ate dinner together at it every night. Which sounds like a small thing, but was not small at all to Maria. She settled into the job and found quickly that James had been right. She was good at it. Genuinely good, in the way you can only be good at something when it actually fits the way your mind works. Within 14 months, she was promoted. She sent James a letter about 6 months after she started, handwritten, on real paper, because an email felt too easy for what she wanted to say. She told him what the job had meant, what the apartment meant, what it felt like to watch her kids settle into a life that had room in it. She told him that she thought about that flight often, not just because of what he did, but because of how he did it, without making her feel small, without making it about himself, without turning her hardest moment into a story he could tell later. James framed the letter and kept it in his office, not on the wall where clients could see it, but on the shelf behind his desk where only he could. He had also, quietly and without announcing it, started flying commercial once a month, not because he had to, but because he had learned something important on that flight too. Something about what happens when you slow down long enough to actually notice the person sitting next to you. And Maria, now settled at her own desk in that 14th floor office, had carried something forward from that day that no salary or promotion could have given her, The understanding that being helped with grace doesn't make you weak. And that the right thing to do when someone pulls you up is to turn around and reach back. She did exactly that, every chance she got. For every person who crossed her path and needed someone to simply stop, pay attention and say, I see you, and I think you're more capable than you know.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.